Hello, welcome to the Authors Club LitLunch online for February 2021. My name is Chris Schuler and I'm delighted to introduce our guest author, Francis Spufford.
Thank you.
Francis is the author of 5 works of non-fiction, including Backroom Boys, about the unsung heroes of British technology, Red Plenty, which charts the Soviet Union's ambitious attempt to match US productivity in the 50s and 60s, and Unapologetic, a personal defense of Christianity. His first novel, Golden Hill, won the Costa First Novel Award and the Ondaatje Prize, and was shortlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award. He teaches writing at Goldsmiths College, London. His second novel, Light Perpetual, published by Faber this month, follows the lives that 5 men and women would have lived through the second half of the 20th century had they not been killed as infants when a V2 rocket obliterated a branch of Woolworths in the fictional southeast London borough of Bexford in November 1944. The novel was Radio 4's Book of the Week and is still available on the BBC Iplayer. Francis, I'm fascinated by the fact that you had actually written 5 works of non-fiction before you ventured your hand at fiction, although it's very noticeable, particularly in Backroom Boys and Red Plenty, that you were experimenting with fictional techniques. Although you were describing real people and real events, you brought the reader into their lives in very much the way a novelist would. Was that a conscious decision, or did you find that, oh, I can write fiction?
Oh, I didn't let myself know that I could write fiction for a very long time, which is why it took me 20 plus years of being a professional writer to dare to write something that actually had novel on its label. But I think the kind of non-fiction writer I was always one with storytelling in the mix somewhere. My interest in non-fictional subjects was kind of led and structured by the stories I could find in the material to tell, and that's how my interest in sort of the real world organized itself. And now I've flitted over the line between non-fiction and fiction. I suppose I think of myself as a quite documentary novelist. That is to say, the things that excite me about making stuff up in novels run fairly close to the things I've found out when I'm looking into the kind of at least the non-fictional roots of the story I want to tell. So that, for example, although my 5 main characters in Light Perpetual are killed by a fictional V2 falling on a fictional branch of Woolworths in a fictional South London suburb, what got me started was a completely real V2 falling on a completely real branch of Woolworths in the completely real setting of New Cross. I walked past the New Cross, the site of what used to be the New Cross Woolworths on my way to teach at Goldsmiths College over and over again, and I've been thinking about it. So in some ways it's been a big change becoming a novelist. In other ways I can kind of see the continuities as well.
Yes, and one of the things that struck me about the novel is that you revisit the lives of these 5 people at more or less 15-year intervals. And those intervals take in the huge social changes that have taken place in Britain since the Second World War, particularly, we're looking at Harold Wilson's white heat of technology. We're looking at Thatcher's radical restructuring of the economy. And we're looking at the Blair years. And you also take in all those social changes. I mean, in some ways, the book is a social history.
Yes, it was stealth social history, perhaps, with dialogue and dialogue and even the occasional joke. But I hope not just social history. I picked that 15-year gap craftily because it is both long enough to move the characters on from one phase of life to the next one, so that they can go from being kind of young to being early middle age to being late middle age to being old with the way that But the perspectives alter in life, and different things come to the fore, and the landscape shifts. But also because at the same time, 15 years is long enough to move you from kind of era to era in history, in the shared life of London as a city. So each time we jump, I wanted it to be a jump. I wanted it to have some of the same kind of natural seeming shock of a before and after photograph, when you suddenly see somebody as they are when they're 15 years older. And if you study their face, you can see that they are definitely still the same person, but a whole load of history, their personal history and of public history, has happened to their faces. And it happened to them gradually. It happened to them day by day by day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But when you look at the photographs of it, you can see the effect of it as a thing in itself, all of a jump. And I wanted those little surprises to be apparent in the book, because that's a truth about lives and history too. We do get used to the changes coming gradually, but every now and again you need the shock of realization that you've arrived in a different place, both in life and in history.
Yes, having read the book, I then caught the adaptation on Radio 4, which was, I thought, pretty skillfully adapted. But actually hearing it again, I noticed all sorts of things, links, things that you'd prepared that I hadn't picked up the first time round, because of course I didn't know where it was going. I mean, there's a short chapter in 1949 when the 5 kids are about 9 years old, and they're in school and they're in a singing lesson. And hearing that on the radio, having read it before I'd read the rest of the book, I suddenly realized how cleverly you sketched out all of their characters in that one little scene, and how little clues would actually develop into, major personality traits later in their lives. Could you possibly say something about, introduce these 5 people to listeners?
The five children who we first meet being destroyed by a V2 and then returning to a singing lesson 5 years later, they are a pair of sisters, Val and Jo, in fact twins, who all working class South Londoners at a point where, thanks to the post-war changes, what used to be kind of rigid in the kind of social structure of South London is melting and becoming much more fluid and much more unpredictable. So their lives are going to be a lot more different and a lot more kind of scattered from each other than the lives of previous generations would have been. But Val and Jo, who are twins, Jo is the musical one. Jo is the one who really loves the singing lesson. And one of the things I'm planting there is the way that Jo lives inside music. Her sister Val has reacted differently to coming from a kind of all-female household, because their father didn't come back from the war, so it's them, their mum, and their auntie in the house, and it has left Val with a kind of, even at 9, a sort of fascinated, flirtatious, neck craning in sort of interest in the world of boys and what it's like out there in those other worlds, which will cause her trouble, not in a kind of inevitable way. I don't believe that character is destiny, but character is sort of possibility. And she has a piece of bad luck later on in terms of who she runs into and falls for, which leads her somewhere eventually very dark indeed in the world of the kind of sort of extreme right-wing politics in the 1970s, but then back again and onwards to somewhere better. Jo, on the other hand, goes off, is a backing singer and goes off to Los Angeles and nearly becomes a rock star and is a rock star's girlfriend, but returns to London to be a music teacher, where her music lessons are extremely different from the one we first see her in at the beginning. Also in the class is Alec, clever Alec, whose father and grandfather are in a hereditary way typesetters. So he is grown up in a household which is to do with words and the production of words, but working class version rather than middle class version. And Alec is one of those people who is a bit more combative and a bit more impulsively speaks cleverly before he thinks about it than is ideal for his own comfort. And we see him deliberately winding up the headmaster to stop him bullying their class teacher in 1949. And later on, he becomes a trade unionist kind of on Fleet Street during the most vexed time of relations between the print unions and management. And later on, when his skill vanishes thanks to the arrival of computers and whopping and so on, he goes off and almost vengefully does an open university degree and turns himself into a primary school teacher and actually ends up as the headmaster of the school that they all started off in. There's Ben, an extremely small child who is almost the kind of the holy fool of the book, though his eyes are sort of permanently wedged slightly wider open than other people's, but both for good and ill. He sees more light and he sees more darkness, and he spends a chunk of his life tragically afraid of his own thoughts. He's a bus conductor and soldiers on doing the kind of completely invisible hard labor of mental illness without telling anyone about it for years and years and years and years, until he has a piece of luck in middle age and then becomes, I hope, if I've done it right, about as happy as he was miserable before. And lastly, there's Vern, who aha, I can see where you immediately belong on the spectrum of responses to Vern. I'll have you know there are people for whom Vern is their favorite character.
Well, I have to admit, you actually, I mean, he is a very unlovable character in many respects, but you actually make him likable and sympathetic. You've succeeded with that.
Good, because he does. Vern is he's a bully as a child. He's a ruthless person. He never really learns how to love or how to treat other people as anything but kind of instruments and tools. But he has this kind of secret compartment in his head in which he keeps his completely helpless kind of response to opera. Looked at one way, he spends his entire life working hard to ignore what opera is trying to tell him, but looked at another way, it is the kind of saving bit of his soul. He fails repeatedly as a kind of property developer somewhere on the fringes of being a con artist, and eventually makes his packet doing the gentrification of South London, until, since he's an inveterate gambler, he finally loses it all again, and kind of ends up as a kind of deeply reluctant dependent in his daughter's household. So that's them. And I hope that the novel sort of spreads out and follows 5 very different kind of destinies, which don't have much in common except that 2 of them are sisters, and the same piece of South London keeps coming up over and over again. It's not the kind of book where they all turn out to be of world historical importance, and because they're alive, history goes differently. It doesn't. They're just people. But the ordinariness of their lives seems to me to have quite enough in it to talk about without making them into kind of hinges of great historical changes.
Yes, one thing that struck me about the book is that is your fascination with technology. This comes out obviously in your previous non-fiction works, but I was particularly struck by the description of fairly early on in the book of Alec working his linotype machine. And having worked in the industry myself, I thought, I know where this one's going. And I was actually on the picket line at Wapping. And so I was fascinated to see how that would develop.
Chris, did I get it reasonably right in terms of feeling? I feel like I need to ask you here.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay.
I mean, I wasn't on a Fleet Street paper at the time, but I was working really on a magazine just off Fleet Street. So yes, it was all quite, it was very reminiscent actually, and the whole period of the time, and the union politics as well. You know, I remember when, you know, at one point I was having to mail out blocks of adverts to local papers all around the country, and you couldn't send them out without an NGA sticker on them, you know. And you know, it was it was certainly a fascinating time, and in many ways it was tragic to see the way a whole very highly developed skill was just rendered obsolete in a very short space of time.
That's what I wanted to get across, the sense of whole worlds of kind of detailed and impressive knowledge suddenly becoming redundant, and something which had its own history going back to kind of, you know, early Victorian times. It made perfect sense that the print craft unions were all products of the 1820s and 30s, because, you know, that's how long that history had been running.
Absolutely. I was also struck by the descriptions of the way people interact with technology to create things, not just Alec with his linotype machine, but the description of Joe putting down a demo tape on a 4-track. You know, that is, you describe it in great detail and with great care and interest. Is that process of kind of human creativity a theme in the book?
It is, and I was going to, I mean, you've already said what I was going to say anyway. I was going to try and gently nudge you away from the idea that I might just have a nerdy fascination with machines, but although I kind of do to some extent. But I think of it as being part of exactly taking human creativity seriously, not just the spectacular, eye-catching kinds, but the ordinary, everyday kinds which go into the world of work. Because one of my complaints about fiction, which I suppose I may have smuggled in my suitcase over the border from non-fiction, is that fiction doesn't spend very much time on the whole talking about people at work, when going to work one way or another occupies a huge share of most people's conscious lives, waking lives even. It's where we do most of, you know, not all of what we do, but an awful lot of it, and it's where we express ourselves, make friends, cope, discover who we are, and do that whole elaborate, I'm not going to be able to put this very well, creativity is part of it, but there's something about finding yourself in the material world by the constant process of using tools to make things and to do things with other people, and then in turn being kind of subtly molded by the things we use and the places we work. We make it makes us. Work goes kind of both ways round, and I wanted to get some of that in anyway, the kind of sort of what it's like working as a musician. I'm not one. What it's like working as a typographer. I am not one. What it's, you know, what it's like working as a bus conductor. I'm not one, and there aren't very many bus conductors anymore anyway.
That's another job that's gone. Yeah,
I know. But a characteristically urban job, part of helping other people move in the metropolis, kind of intermediary jobs. And actually lots of the jobs I've given them are kind of betwixt and between jobs. Bus conductors get people from one place to another. Compositors turn journalists' words into newspapers. Musicians turn thoughts, dreams, and emotions that everyone has had into things you can hum. They're all go-betweens, one way and another. I'm feel I may be wandering off the subject enthusiastically here.
No, not at all. I mean, music is very important in the book, isn't it? I mean, it almost starts with a singing lesson, and it ends with music. I won't reveal how.
Thank you.
And then, of course, there is both the popular music, which we experience largely through Joe, partly through Val as well, and there's of course the world of opera that means so much to Vern, and his one, you know, into which he challenges all the human emotions he suppresses in every other area of his life. Could you say a bit more about the musical aspect of the book?
It's not the kind of book which has a plot one can really spoil, but I am actually glad that you're keeping back that one particular thing about how music comes back at the end. I knew I wanted the whole book to have, well, I wanted it to have a soundtrack for one thing, because the changing music of the changing decades gives you such a kind of quick way in to the feel of different times. But I wanted to get on the inside of the music as well, the making of it and the kind of the responding to it, not just the kind of hearing it on a transistor in the distance. But all right, multiple reasons. Because music is the most genuinely popular art. It is the thing which working class South Londoners received and made just as actively, but also it's the thing that gets everywhere. It's the nearest thing to music is firework displays in terms of its capacity to make absolutely everybody go ooh at the same time. And music contains, for enormous numbers of people, their deepest sense of where in their lives they are and what the turning points of life are. Music provides a kind of deeply felt series of wells of emotion that people dip into, and I wanted that because although I'm jumping onwards through time, I wanted to get a sense of what the kind of the really strong emotional kind of underground rivers of all these lives were, and music does that. And lastly, but not leastly, there's something about time as well, and it's a book about time, and it's a book about the time of people's lives and what it's like living in time, and what it would be like to suddenly get back the time of a life which you've kind of lost suddenly by dying as a child. But it's also about in all sorts of ways the kind of the human perception of time, what it's like, what a working day feels like, what it's like kind of struggling with something frightening, what it's like being happy and feeling the day kind of zoom past and wishing you could hold it, but hoping that you can count on another good day tomorrow. But the kind of microscopic part of that, the smallest unit of time, is the song. It's where human beings often notice time most self-consciously, when it's going past for 3 minutes and 27 seconds of a song, or for one aria in an opera. They notice kind of a human beings cooperating with the tick of the clock as it goes past, and weaving melody through it, and kind of weaving meaning through it, making the sense we make of our lives, you know, in a unit this big, and then putting it down and storing it and being able to pick it up again later. And that's why the reel-to-reel tape recorder in 1979 in Joe's story is important, because it does in fact mean that she is storing lost time in the form of the songs she's trying to write, which can then disappear into a cardboard box and without giving away too much, come back later at a point where I am giving it away, really, aren't I? And come back later, damn it, at the end of the book. But
which leads me on to the fact that although all the characters in the book go through some very bleak times in their lives, in some cases more extreme than others. After the changes in print technology, Alec is in the doldrums for the best part of a decade. Val ends up in prison. Ben, as you've already mentioned, has really terrifying mental health experiences. Yet for most of them, it does seem to come good by the end. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it was anything as glib as a happy ending, but they do reach at least a plateau of content and stability.
Yeah, and I hope even for Vern, who gets all his joy in the form of opera, there's some sort of balance between woe and joy by the end of it. And I don't mean it to be a miserable book. I have seen the odd review going, and they're all so miserable, it's scarcely worth them being saved from the V2, which is not what I had in mind, because it seems to me that what they are spared to get is the whole range of human experience, including the despairing parts, but also very much including the joyous parts. I mean it to be a celebration of life, which means, if you're taking it seriously, celebrating the mixture of dark and light in life. It's part of being here is being open to the awfulness of what can happen, as well as open to the kind of the wonders of what can happen.
Yeah, and I would, for the benefit of our listeners, I would point out that it is often very, very funny. So finally, as I think we're sort of probably approaching the end of our allotted time, I wanted to raise the title, Light Perpetual, which of course comes from the prayer book. Rest eternal grant to them, O Lord, and let light perpetual shine upon them. Vernon might recognize it more readily as the Lux Perpetua in the Latin Mass. Now, you have written a non-fiction book, Unapologetic, which is a fairly trenchant defense of your Christian faith, and you are actually married to an Anglican priest. To what extent does your faith inform this novel? I mean, clearly, you've referenced it in the title.
I suppose it's one of the underground rivers of my life, and as a result, it tends to come up when I dip things in my particular wells of imagination. But it's not something. It's something which kind of helplessly and habitually gives shape to the things I imagine. It's my serious sense of how the universe works and how it's shaped. So yeah, it tends to come up, but more in terms of what shape I think experience is, and the way in which I think that even awful things can be redeemed. It's not a book with very much explicit presence for religion in it at all. Val at one point gets asked if she'd like to come to church and goes, no thanks. But I wanted there to be a sense. I mean, light means all sorts of things in the book. It starts off being the light of the V2 going off, but I want to suggest that there are various lights that are worth paying attention to, and one of them may be a kind of sort of merciful light shining from kind of outside time on us as we set about making messes of things, going to work, having good days, having bad days. There's some perpetual light leaking in through the cracks. This is a thought that it is through the cracks that the light comes in, to quote a very well-known song. And I suppose on some level, I've got in mind another famous book that began in the Blitz, which is William Golding's Darkness Visible. So Light Perpetual, ladies and gentlemen, is the cheery answer to Darkness Visible. Not that cheery, but it's more cheery than William Golding, I'll tell you that.
Well, thank you so much. I really heartily recommend the novel. It's a terrific read, and it's a fascinating journey through the social history of this country over the past half century or so. And I wish you every success with it, and thank you very much for taking part in this discussion. Thanks, Francis.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.